Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Monday, March 14th, 2022. Hope you had a great weekend. I had some time with the in-laws this weekend and ready. It was awesome. I hope you had a really good weekend as well. I'm ready to get back to work. And on this episode, I've got highlights of two new federal gun control regulations from the ATF coming through an executive order that are set to go into effect this summer. We're talking about things called 80% lowers and pistol braces. Plus, I've got a quick overview of what needs to be done to stop them. Most importantly, action by the people, but also a state law that went into effect last year in Montana and another one that's pending this year in Kentucky, along with other bills or laws that went into effect like Missouri, Arizona, and elsewhere. I'll get to all that in just a moment. But first of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow us. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. There you're going to find all the archives of the show for almost 4 years. Pretty amazing to me because I kind of started as a hobby, and I'm really enjoying sharing this information in this manner with you. I appreciate all of those of you who've been following and supporting us, leaving reviews and all that stuff. Anyway, so almost 4 years of archives. I publish a blog post for every single individual episode on that show homepage as well. And there you're going to find, each individual episode, links that I talk about. So when I mention something and I'm highlighting an article that I'm talking about, that will be linked to in the show notes. You can find all the different platforms we're on. We're on a bunch of different platforms. My favorite on the video end right now is the decentralized, censorship-resistant Odyssey.com. Make sure to follow us there, especially if you don't want to be censored. And then we have the audio-only podcast edition and even our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. And I don't think anyone makes this small amount of money go as long as we do in support of the Constitution and liberty. Again, the show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And while we give people another minute or so to get notifications to join us on the live stream, I want to say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you being here. There's Cheriton Farmer in Missouri. Vivian, first time on the live stream. Thank you for being here. Tim Martin in Arizona. Dixie Strong in Alabama. Haji in Oakland County, Michigan. Clay Kent. Haji says, don't comply, nullify. That's absolutely the number one and most important way to keep the government in check. And I have an episode that I'm going to be referencing in the show notes a little bit later in this episode. Beth Winslow, happy Monday. Johnny Johnson, good morning. Blue North Wind, good to see you as well. Refuse the money. Be non-compliant. Become ungovernable. I love that this kind of messaging is finally getting out there. I know you guys have been on board with this as long as you've been around us. I know that, and probably before for many of you. But we're seeing this in areas that I never thought I would see it in my lifetime. So that's positive. Michelle McCutcheon, I appreciate you being here. Ed Hen, Run Level 1. I always stumble over that one. Johnny Johnson, Mad Mom, Justin and Ightlander, good to see you in South Carolina. Liberty Revolutionary, good to see you as well in Missouri. Joseph, Michael Hodge, and everyone else. We're on Rumble as well. A bunch of other platforms. We're on as many as you can think of, or at least that I can think of. So if you've got any suggestions where we should be, please do let me know in the chat. Anyways, let's get right to this. I want to start out with an article that we recently published by the great Mike Meharry. Mike's been doing so much work with the TAC for so long. He is so consistent and reliable. I love the man as a friend and as a brother. And he's also one of the greatest supporters of the Constitution and liberty out there. And many people don't know who he is. He just does the work because he cares. Anyway, so we've got these two regulations coming from the ATF. They're from an executive order from Uncle Joe, that criminal that I talked about last week at the episode. If you haven't checked out the episode on the Federal Equitable Sharing Civil Asset Forfeiture Program that's been around for almost 40 years, and Uncle Joe had his hands in that one as well. This guy is really a problem. But anyways, they all are. The first, Mike writes, would require registration of 80% lowers. These are basically unfinished firearm parts that you can use to build your own gun. This is not a gun enthusiast channel, so I have no expertise in this. But what I do have expertise in is when the federal government does something, what do you need to do to stop them? Anyways, going forward, because 80% lowers fall outside the FFL process, they effectively allow the private manufacture of unregistered rifles or guns or firearms or whatever. Some refer to them as ghost guns. There's handguns, etc. The new ATF regulation is expected to be finalized in June. I mean, we know pretty much what it is. And when you use these 80% lowers, you make them at home, for example, if you've got some skills, and people keep telling me you don't need much skill at all, you just need the right tools. And it's definitely probably over my head at this point, but it's probably something I should learn how to do eventually. But you don't have a serial number, and government hates it when you can exercise your natural right to self-defense, your natural right to keep and bear arms, and they can't track who has what, because all they care about, it's kind of like a central bank digital currency. You can think about a way to get out of the fiat, funny money Federal Reserve System is, of course, to use gold and silver as much as possible. But for those who want to use technology and be faster about it, some people are thinking about digital currency. But digital currency can be very traceable, so you have to start thinking privacy-minded. There's a lot to learn on this stuff. Anyways, government hates it when you can do things and they can't follow and watch what you're doing. That's why we see so many surveillance cameras and facial recognition and the real ID, national ID cards, all this stuff. They want to know what everyone's doing at all times, and guns is a big one. Here from Pew Pew Tactical, there was a lot of sites that I could have cited on this one, but this one has such an awesome name, I'd never seen it before. I thought I'd go to it. They say 80% lowers, such as an 80% AR-15 lower receiver. These are items that have not yet reached a stage of manufacture to be considered a firearm. I've got a picture of it up on the screen. It's basically a part. It's a firearm part. It doesn't shoot anything. If I have a steering wheel, do I own a car? If I have a drivetrain, do I own a car? And then I have to have a driver's license? Well, maybe after you put it all together or something like that. I mean, licensing is a problem as well, but is it a car if you just have the base parts, or even a lot of the parts, or all of them, but you haven't assembled them? Well, of course, the ATF wants to control everybody, and they don't like people being able to do things outside of their purview. Here from Walker and Taylor Law, they have a pretty good overview of this. And they say they have a section called "What is a Ghost Gun?" And they said this refers to firearms built from parts without serial numbers, which are required on firearms made by licensed manufacturers. And again, if you're a licensed manufacturer, the problem is the licensing process. As soon as they add that licensing process, as soon as you get a permit, then they can add qualifications to that permit. And we see how that happens over time. The argument goes, they write, that the availability of the parts allow prohibited persons. That's another problem. Are there people that should be prohibited by the federal government from owning a firearm? And I would say the number of people that should be prohibited by the federal government for owning a firearm is zero. There is no federal gun control in any situation that is authorized by the Constitution, the base original Constitution, and then even as amended even further by the Second Amendment. The argument goes that the availability allows them to bypass this NICS system, National Instant Criminal Background Check System. If you follow 10th Amendment Center on Twitter, or me at Michael Bolden, spelled out, you probably saw something over the last few days. Well, who knows what Twitter is actually showing. But I think over at TAC, and then I retweeted or vice versa. Sometimes that happens. We posted something talking about how the NRA claimed in 2018, this is written by Stephen Hallbrook, who a lot of people look as a really great legal mind when it comes to the right to keep and bear arms. But he said, the Brady Act, this NICS system, really should have been called the NRA Act. The NRA gave us the National Background Check System, that the National Background Check System is constantly being expanded. And even if you thought it was going to be good to protect us against bad guys right at the beginning, it's going to be expanded. And as soon as you give them one step beyond the limit of the Constitution, and they claim, of course, that it's constitutional, they claim that everything they support, all their gun-grabbing garbage they support is constitutional, well, it just gets worse and worse. Anyway, so this is another problem. So they have this NICS system, they have this approach, government and their supporters, that some people should be prohibited on the federal level, and then they use them together, and then they don't like people being able to make things that get around that, or anyone. So let's say even if there were 5,000 people that the federal government were authorized by the Constitution and morally to prevent people from owning a means of self-defense, does that mean collective punishment? I mean, if you think about the terrorist attacks of 2001, what was the horrible part about that? Let's say there was actual grievances. Is the proper way to attack innocent civilians or claim that everyone is guilty? This is collective punishment. This is the mentality of a bin Laden, a Stalin, a Mao, the worst of the worst. And to do collective punishment, man, I can't even come to words on that one. Anyways, here from the ATF, an agency that should not exist, or as the old joke goes, I think it should be ATFW, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and weed. That would make a nice corner store here in downtown LA. Although part of that is illegal. Anyways, 80%, at least in LA it is. In other states, the other part is illegal. Here's what they say at the ATF. What is an 80% or unfinished receiver? They always put this in quotes because they want to pretend that it's actually a firearm. They want, for years, and this was published in 2020. I think it was up there a couple of years earlier. So they've held this position all along that these parts, even if it's 80%, 90%, 40%, whatever, they want to be able to classify it as a firearm to regulate it under the GCA, the Unconstitutional Gun Control Act of 1968, or the NFA, National Firearms Act of 1934, which we'll get to in a moment as well. And so they put these in quotes because they don't want to think that this is a legitimate term. 80% receiver, 80% finished, 80% complete, and unfinished receiver. They write, are all terms referring to an item that some may believe has not yet reached a stage of manufacture that meets the definition of firearm frame or receiver according to the Gun Control Act. Notice how at Pew Pew Tactical, and basically everywhere else, they all take this position that, well, and of course they're manufacturing it. So even if they were wrong, of course, it would be good for them to take this position. But the ATF will absolutely take the position that this is just what some people believe, and they just need to get the regulations in there that puts these parts as firearms. These are not statutory terms they put, and ATF does not use or endorse them. They don't use them, but they used them here. Anyways, just to define them, I guess, we'll never use that word, except when we want to attack it. Back to Walker and Taylor law. Oh, no, this is from the regulation itself. This is from the proposed regulation going into effect most likely this summer, and it's very likely going to be just like this. It's possible they could withdraw it, but I think that's not going to happen because just in January, they just published the likely effective date. This one is June of 2022. The Department of Justice proposes amending Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF regulations, to provide new regulatory definitions of firearm frame or receiver. See, all they do, once they get a law on the book, then what they do over time, they change the definition of the word, and then they expand their power. And then over time, they change the definition of the word to include more stuff, and they just keep doing this. This has been the tool of tyrants for ages. For as long as we can remember, we could see quotes from people like John Williams in the New York Ratifying Convention in 1788 talking about they do this type of thing. Ingenious men will come up with ingenious reasons to have different meanings for the same clause. So all of a sudden, even though if you thought the 1968 Gun Control Act was okay and you didn't want, to include frame or receiver, now they're going to change that to mean that it's a firearm. They want to change firearm, frame or receiver and frame or receiver because the current regulations fail to capture the full meaning of those terms. In other words, they fail to allow us to have the legal jurisdiction to ban them or require you to do stuff, require you to put a serial number on it, require FFLs who have licenses that shouldn't exist just to sell products of self-defense. They're going to have to put serial numbers on it. It's going to cost a lot of people a lot of money, and it's going to make sure that there's less of these in circulation. Here from Walker and Taylor, the ATF believes that the terms frame or receiver have been too narrowly interpreted by the courts. Therefore, the ATF is proposing a new definition, just redefine the word. This is as Orwellian as can be. Now this word means something else. I mean, if you think that that's some kind of future dystopia, we are living it today. It may not seem like it in every facet of our lives, but if you can just take the word frame or receiver and what it was understood to mean under the law in 1968, setting aside that the law shouldn't exist, and then now all of a sudden, decades later, it has a new definition so other people can be in trouble, then you've got a real problem. That's what they did with the bump stock ban in 2018 under the last so-called Second Amendment president who was a piece of garbage, who enforced federal gun control more than anyone in history at that time. I have not seen the numbers on the new guy yet. I'm sure it's going to be pretty bad. It's always bad. But that's what they did. All of a sudden, they said this bump stock, I think they called it a machine gun or a shotgun, something like that. And then people had to turn them in or destroy them. I have not seen updated numbers on how few people have done that yet, but that's a positive. I've seen some positive signs on that. So they want this new definition to more broadly describe a frame or receiver. as a part that provides housing or structure designed to hold or integrate any fire control component. Integral to this new regulatory definition is the use of the broad term fire control component, which is any housing or holding structure for a hammer, bolt carrier, breech block, cylinder, trigger mechanism, firing pin, striker, or slide rails, but is not limited to those particular fire control components. Anyways, those of you who understand that better than I do know what that means, but they're basically putting that technology or those parts, and they want to call it a firearm so they can control it. Under the proposed rule, here from Regulationsgov again, FFLs would be required to mark privately made firearms. If you make it privately and it comes into, and a lot of them get to firearms dealers, maybe a trade-in, whatever it may be, within 7 days, maybe not a trade-in, but a lot of them get there, within 7 days of the firearm received by the licensee or before disposition, whichever first occurs. Licensees would then have 60 days, so they get 60 days to mark them already in inventory after a final rule becomes effective. In other words, put a serial number. We want to track this stuff. We want everyone to have a serial number, like a social security number, I guess. Both FFLs and non-FFLs would have the option to contract with an FFL, such as a gunsmith, for this purpose. Dispose of them or send them to the ATF or another law enforcement agency for disposal. So if you own this thing and it gets to an FFL, and then they have to throw it away, basically. This is a terrible, terrible thing that they're trying to do as normal. And they say, would the proposed here at Walker and Taylor, they ask this important question, are they trying to ban people from making privately, are they trying to ban these PMFs, which is what they're defining, privately made firearms? Well, no, today. I would say absolutely yes in the long run. They don't want anyone to be able to make them at home. And today, of course, under this regulation, no. But do you think that they're not going to change definitions in 5 or 10 or 50 years? We can't allow people in the future. We can't allow them to feel the pain of our dumb, weak actions. Samuel Adams put it the best, I think, and I'm just paraphrasing. He basically said, if we tamely submit or if we tamely, acquiesce in an unconstitutional act or an attack on our liberty, we not only damage ourselves, but we damage those millions yet unborn. We harm them in the future. And we have to start thinking about that. Every time it's a little too difficult to take a stand for something, we also have to think about the people in the future who are going to pay the price for our weakness. Anyways, would the proposed rule to make ghost guns illegal to build at home? Interesting, they say no. Although the proposed rule targets ghost guns, one of the most prominent lines in an over 100-page proposed rule is tucked away that says, however, nothing in this rule would restrict persons not otherwise prohibited from possessing firearms from making their own firearms at home without markings solely for personal use. So you could still make them at home without serial numbers for personal use. But there's a lot of caveats. There's a lot of open roads to change that in the future. They could just change the definition of a personal-made firearm. They could also change who is a restricted person. Maybe a restricted person in the future would actually have to get approval to do this, and then they're still licensed a different way. They can switch this around. They say it seems the impact the new regulations would have on a PMF would be to make it difficult for an individual to create a firearm without using regulated, serialized parts. So in other words, it's a backdoor ban anyways. Firearms Policy Coalition, FPC, is a really good organization on this type of thing. I came across a paper that they released last December that's really, really good. It's titled "The Constitution Protects." Well, this is the blog post that I have up on the screen. I will link to this in the show notes. "The Constitution Protects Self-Made Arms," argues new scholarly article, and the article's titled "The American Tradition of Self-Made Arms." It goes all the way back to the revolutionary times, and it's really, really good history. Anyways, let's get to regulation number 2. The second one, Mike Maharrey, set to go into effect in August. So we've got the first one on these 80% lowers in June, and then in August we have regulations on things called pistol braces, again in quotes. "This device serves as a stabilizer that enables a shooter to fire with one hand." I guess I've never used one. I'm actually not good at firearms. I go from time to time. There's a gun range, I don't know, maybe 10 blocks away. I can walk to it, and they're really, really nice there. It's LA. It's a different type of a thing here, but I've not used one of these, but Mike writes that they serve as a stabilizer. Pistol braces are popular with disabled people. I mean, think about that. They're popular with disabled people. Let's say you only have one arm or the use of one. This makes sense. Who can't use both arms. But the feds claim they are a dangerous firearm accessory. And of course, they make some claims in the proposed regulation that is very close to being finalized in the next few months, that they're not going after people who are disabled. They just think that they can pistol braces are going to turn a handgun into a short-barreled rifle. And so then, therefore, the short-barreled rifle is regulated under the National Firearms Act of 1934. That shouldn't exist. Under the regulation, Mike puts, pistol braces will fall under the National Firearms Act. This is the same law used to regulate machine guns, silencers, and short-barreled rifles. The executive order won't ban these pistol braces, but it will require, well, there's kind of a ban that you have options, and I'll get to that in a moment. But it will require anybody that has one to register it with the feds. This will come with a pretty hefty $200 tax. The power to tax is the power to destroy. And of course, people who need to be able to defend themselves aren't usually the rich people who could hire other people. It's the people who can't afford $200. All these regulations are always going after the people who are the most needy, who are in the most difficult situations, and they always benefit the people with the most loot. It's really, really just nasty stuff. Not that I really want to get into the class warfare type of thing, because that's not my bag, but that's how it plays out. A lot of people don't have $200, paycheck to paycheck, inflation, and now they got to have $200. Some people might just say like, oh, okay, I'm going to throw this thing away like they tell me to. This will come with a $200 tax, and it can take up to 1 year to complete the registration. In effect, it registers the gun with, well, the pistol brace with the federal government. I've got a report here from Congressional Research Service, and in it, and I will link to that, it's a PDF doc, but it basically says there's anywhere from 10 to 40 million of these in private hands. Somewhere between 10 and 40 million of them. And it's even more confusing because the regulation that they're talking about here, I've got it up on the screen. There's like 15 or 20 items. It's a questionnaire that you have to fill out. And there's a point system. You get a certain amount of points for each answer. And if you score too high on the answer, then that pistol brace attached to whatever pistol you're using is no longer a pistol. It's a short-barreled rifle. It's then regulated under the NFA, which shouldn't exist. I mean, this is a very confusing thing. If you ever watched my episode on the whiskey tax, and I'm just thinking about this, the horrible Alexander Hamilton administration, I guess we can call it that rather than the Washington administration. The Hamilton administration, they put all kinds of difficult stuff for people to follow, and it imposed it on people who a lot of them couldn't even read and write. And so they had to follow all these rules and regulations. This type of thing is done by tyrants to affect people, to make it difficult for them so they can catch them. So if you score too high on this point system, then all of a sudden you're going to have basically a banned product. So ATF, here again from Regulationsgov. I will link to this in the show notes so you can read all the garbage in detail should you like to put yourself through that. Anyways, here's what you could do. You could either if you score too high, and now it's an SBR, you can permanently remove or alter the, quote, stabilizing brace such that it cannot be reattached. In other words, destroy it, because if you can't reattach it, you can't use it again, and that's what they're saying. Get rid of this thing. 2, you can remove the barrel. You can remove the barrel and attach a 16-inch or longer barrel, thus removing it from the provisions of the NFA. So if you have a pistol brace on a pistol, and then you add a longer barrel, those of you who actually manufacture your own, you make your own firearms, you would probably know whether or not this is difficult to do or not. You would have to turn it into a long gun, basically. So then they're not trying to control it. Number 3, option 3 is destroy the firearm. Just completely destroy it. ATF will publish information regarding proper destruction on its website, atf.gov. Number 4, turn your firearm in to the local ATF office. These, man. And number 5, complete and submit an application to make and register a firearm. So that's ATF Form 1, a $200 tax payment, etc., etc. Total garbage. So what do we do about it? Well, number 1. The most important thing on this and any federal government measure, actually any government measure, is that if the people comply with the act, it's never, ever going away. So I've got an episode up here that I did in January. Who is supposed to keep the feds in check? It's really not somehow about magically convincing the government to do the right thing, to follow the rules given to it. Well, the only way you convince them to do it is every time they try to violate your rights, they violate the limits of the Constitution. As Thomas Jefferson put it in his opposition to the central bank in 1791, he said to take a single step, one step, beyond the limits drawn around Congress, by the Constitution, is to take hold of a boundless field of power. So every single time they go beyond the limits of the Constitution, the people are supposed to resist it so that the government is then, well, not able to get away with what they do. That's the number one thing that's supposed to happen in response. But, well, it's not easy, especially when we're facing the largest government, the largest empire in the history of the globe, and the state governments, every single one of them are all complicit in helping the federal government enforce federal acts and regulatory programs. We're seeing some cracks in that in various issues. Of course, we have now 37, almost 38 states that are defying the feds on a cannabis plant. We've got all those immigration sanctuaries. We're showing where you can see how opting out is actually destroying federal capability to enforce. And the federal ATF only has 5,100 employees. 5,100 employees, a third of those are in administration, so they've got like 3,800 enforcement agents for the whole country. They can only enforce between 8,000 and 10,000 cases per year. That's between 8,000 and 10,000 too many. And of course, we know that the feds want to have more funding and more ability to deputize state and local law enforcement, to have them participate on federal-state joint task forces to enforce federal gun control. So we have to actually recognize that they have a numbers game problem. If 10 or 11 or 12 or 13 million of these so-called short-barreled shotguns, short-barreled rifles exist without serial numbers in defiance of the National Firearms Act of 1934, which should not exist, there's zero chance that the federal government could ever make a dent in it. And then on top of it, if the people are defying, if the states and localities stop helping the ATF enforce these things, then it makes it even more difficult. We know this. This is how it has played out all along. And I've covered that in many other episodes at other times. I'm not going to necessarily cover that in any detail right now. But of course, if you've watched or listened to the show for any amount of time, you've heard me talk about the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act, which the DOJ is suing the state of Missouri right now because they hate the fact that the Second Amendment Preservation Act is severing relationships between state and local law enforcement and the ATF. To some degree, this is a very important part of this because the less that the local law enforcement are helping the feds enforce, the more that it kicks it back to the feds, and they don't have the person power to do it on their own, period. So Missouri is an important one, but I also want to talk about one that we don't hear anything about, and that's in Montana. A similar bill without enforcement penalties passed into law in Arizona. It's a good first step. We just have to see how it plays out in practice there in Arizona, House Bill 2111. Maybe Tim Martin, who I see in the chat pretty often here, can keep me informed on that. Tim, if you've got any info, please send an email my way. Anyways, in Montana last year, House Bill 258 was signed into law. This was a piece of legislation that was intentionally going to go after Gary Marbut at Montana Shooting Sports Association, or is it Sports Shooting? Shooting Sports Association. These are some of the best activists in the country on the state level. And Gary had a piece of legislation that was their version of what was passed into law in Missouri. And Gary actually started this before we did many, many years ago. So this is like the grandfather of this Second Amendment sanctuary movement. He doesn't like that term, but they really have created this kind of model approach. And they had a piece of legislation that would have banned the state from enforcing basically all federal gun control measures, past, present, and future. It got killed because law enforcement, of course, opposed it. They don't like anything that restricts their power, and they love helping their federal partners because they get a lot of federal loot through grant programs, civil asset forfeiture, and the like, and they love the drug war, and gun control is used as a tool to ramp up penalties in the drug war, all this kind of side stuff. But it was opposed, and then so they actually decided, rather than just throwing in the towel and coming back in 2 years and going for it, at that point they decide, you know what, let's draw a line in the sand. We'll do the same bill, but we're not going to address any current gun control on the books. Let's only go for stuff that may come down the line. And so they actually got that passed. And I wonder if it was an interesting trick by Gary and his team, because then all of a sudden the cops stopped opposing it. Okay, you're not going to tell us to stop doing anything. Okay, well, we're on board with that. So that got passed into law, and it actually bans the state from enforcing any federal gun control measure is implemented on or after January of 2021, or any current regulation that's given a more restrictive definition. So just what we're talking about here, House Bill 258, it addresses that as well. Any federal law, executive order, rule, regulation that is enacted, adopted, or becomes effective on or after January 1st, 2021, or a new and more restrictive interpretation of an existing law that existed at that time that infringes upon, calls in question, or prohibits, restricts, or requires individual licensure for or registration of the purchase, ownership, possession, transfer, or use of any firearm, any magazine or other ammunition feeding device, or other firearm accessory. So anything. So this is actually going to address these two new regulations that came out of executive order. And maybe last year I was told a few times, like, oh, okay, what's the point of just saying we're not going to address the stuff that's on the books, but we're going to only look at the future? And I said, well, there's always going to be more, and they couldn't get it done. So this was really, really smart strategy on that part. And we see a similar piece of legislation moving forward in Kentucky. House Bill 29 just passed out of the state house. It's basically the same piece of legislation. It would address that if it passes into law this year. So House Bill 29 in Kentucky, if you live there, you definitely want to support that measure. I did an episode, 4 Essential Steps to Nullify Federal Gun Control, that talks about this strategy in more detail earlier this year. I will link to that in the show notes so you can check it out or check it out again. And I want to close out with this one important meme that I think we can't repeat this one enough. For those of you who are listening, I'll just read it off. Disband. That's the only thing the ATF is authorized to do under the Constitution. Anyways, I hope you learned something. This is not good news, but it's important for us to know what's coming and what we need to do about it. So I hope it was educational and informational. I hope there's something you can chew on and maybe work on in your own area. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. Here, someone says, I'm a police officer in the chat. Anyways, I will get to the chat in just a moment. This is really interesting. If you support the work that we're doing, you want more people to learn about this, you want to help us take a stand for the Constitution and liberty, teach people what it means and how to defend it when the government refuses to do its job, which is constantly. You can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And of course, please consider smashing the like button on any of the video platforms and leaving comments in the archive. Reviews on Apple Podcasts help out a ton. All that stuff really helps us spread the word. Anyways, I want to look at this comment here. I can't verify the person, but they say, I'm a police officer. ATF is heavily reliant on local police to enforce their warrants. I will always refuse to participate, and I encourage my fellow officers to abstain as well. And that is really, really important. We know that basically in every situation, the general understanding that I have of an ATF enforcement action is there is one or two ATF agents, generally one, that's assigned from the field office in the area. And if they're going to go raid someplace, it's basically all local cops, local sheriffs, that you can see them in a V pattern getting ready to bust down the door. These are all locals. These are not federal agents. So if the locals don't help them, you got that one dude. What are you going to do? Go after a firearms manufacturer? I don't think that's going to happen. They don't have the resources, and it's important to refuse to comply and nullify. James Madison in Federalist 46 specifically told us that when states refuse to help enforce the federal actions, along with the people refusing to comply, this creates an environment the federal government, in James Madison's words, would hardly be willing to encounter. ES says, I would love to get help in writing up some local ordinances. Fortunately for you, we have model legislation for that. I do not have a link to that handy, but if you want to email team@10thamendmentcenter.com sometime in the near-ish future, I'm catching up after the weekend off with family, so sometime in the near-ish future, I'll get back to you with a link to that model ordinance for localities. Other than that, the hundreds and hundreds that have passed on a local level in the last few years, almost none of them actually do what needs to be done. Anyways, looking a little further, Strawman says, I'm tired of monarchs. Clay Kent, awesome as usual. I really, really appreciate it. Run Level 1 says, the $200 tax is cruel and unusual. 10 years for not paying it. That penalty far exceeds any other penalty for not paying a tax in the U.S. You can owe hundreds of thousands and not get 10 years. I did not know that it was a 10-year penalty. They really, really hate the right to keep and bear arms at basically every level of government. M. Gabriel says, Missouri here. Thanks, Michael. I appreciate you being here. Ron Sandin, retired police here. Oh, I really appreciate you guys actually, stepping up and commenting about this. I don't always have nice things to say about cops because so many of them help the government do the stuff that they're the enforcement arm of the government. But people like you who are telling the truth and actually saying, hey, this has got to stop, I'm very grateful for that. Thank you so much, Ron. Ron says, retired police here. ATF needs to go. The Constitution is clear. Most cops that know the Constitution and take it seriously hate the ATF. I sure hope so. That is actually a very positive thing for me to hear. I'm going to take that and run with it. Rob Wood, good to see you, buddy. How can they pass a bill to commandeer local law enforcement when it has a long history of Supreme Court precedents against doing so? Well, they claim, they're not actually passing a bill to commandeer, Rob. And I know there's been some actual misinformation out there. They claim that they're not commandeering, and really in many cases they're not. The problem is on the state and local level, they're volunteering. The feds throw out the cash and they love getting the loot. So the politicians, that includes the sheriffs, they love partnering. Basically, every law enforcement agency in the country has what's called an MOU or an MOA, Memorandum of Understanding, or a Memorandum of Agreement with the ATF. They have them with the DEA. They also sign agreements to participate in all kinds of anti-terrorism task forces. They get all kinds of grant money. They apply for the Civil Asset Forfeiture Program, of course, the Equitable Sharing Program, and they voluntarily participate. That's why measures like what passed in Missouri, the Second Amendment Preservation Act, that says if you do this, we're going to fine the agency $50,000 for every person that they hire that helps the feds enforce this wide list of federal gun control, past, present, and future. And that's why those agencies are saying, well, we're not going to participate in these ATF joint task forces anymore. And that's really, really important to do. In Montana, they don't do that. We'll see how it plays out without that kind of we'll call it a trigger for the law, but there is a trigger that now bans them. Once this goes into effect, they will be banned according to the law. I do know that Gary and the team in Montana will certainly be having an eye out on this, so I'm going to maybe reach out to them in the near future, and hopefully they can give me some insight on how things are playing out in Montana this summer. Anyways, I appreciate you being here. I know I'm getting rambling a little long. I appreciate all the comments. I will look back to that a little bit later today and see if there's anything else I can answer or maybe get ideas for future episodes. I'm definitely covering one on James Madison. I believe his birthday is on Wednesday, so I'll probably do something on James Madison. I've got some more on the anti-federalist writer Cato in the near future, and if you've got ideas, I'm happy to consider them. And if I've got some insight, I will definitely do an episode on that. You can always email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Again, I really appreciate you being here. I hope you had a great weekend. I hope your week is off to a good start, and I look forward to seeing you next time here on the path to liberty.